Picture this: a young woman stands at a window in the grand palace of Versailles, watching her husband dance with another woman. Her heart breaks a little more with each graceful step he takes, each smile he bestows upon his mistress. This woman is Maria Theresa of Spain, Queen of France, and her story is one of sacrifice, loneliness, and a love that reshaped the destiny of two great nations. What you're about to discover is how one princess's marriage ended over a century of bloodshed between France and Spain, yet condemned her to a life of beautiful misery in the most glittering court in Europe. The autumn wind whispered through the corridors of El Escorial Palace on September 10, 1638, carrying with it the cries of a newborn princess who would one day hold the fate of Europe in her tiny hands. Maria Theresa entered the world as the daughter of Philip IV of Spain, ruler of an empire so vast that the sun truly never set upon it, stretching from the silver mines of Peru to the spice islands of the Philippines. Her mother, Elizabeth of France, held her newborn daughter close, perhaps sensing that joy in the Habsburg household was as fragile as morning frost. Elizabeth herself was a bridge between two enemy nations, a French princess who had become Spain's queen just as her daughter would one day reverse that journey. The irony of history was already weaving its intricate patterns around this innocent child. Before we continue with Maria Theresa's extraordinary story, I want to share something special with you. If you're finding this tale as captivating as I am, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories of remarkable women to light. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about the incredible women from history who inspire you. The Palace of El Escorial, where Maria Theresa spent her early years, was more than a royal residence. It was a monument to Spanish power and Catholic devotion, its austere granite walls housing both a palace and a monastery. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of Spanish kings and the whispered prayers of monks, the little princess learned her first lessons about duty, faith, and the weight of royal blood. But fate, that cruel sculptor of royal lives, had already begun chiseling away at the young princess's world. Her mother, Elizabeth, bore child after child, yet death seemed to hover over the royal nursery like a persistent shadow. Brothers and sisters came and went like brief candles in the wind, their tiny coffins carried through the same corridors where Maria Theresa played with her wooden dolls. The year 1644 marked the first great tragedy of Maria Theresa's young life. She was only 6 when her mother, Elizabeth, succumbed to complications following yet another miscarriage. The palace halls, once filled with her mother's gentle laughter and French lullabies, fell silent. Maria Theresa found herself clinging to her nurse's skirts, searching for the warm embrace that would never come again. 2 years later, when Maria Theresa had just celebrated her 8th birthday, death claimed its most precious prize. Her brother, Balthazar Charles, the golden prince upon whom all of Spain's hopes rested, fell ill and died at the tender age of 16. In those medieval chambers, lit by flickering candles, as courtiers whispered prayers and her father wept openly, Maria Theresa realized that she was now the sole heir to the Spanish throne. The weight of an empire settled upon her young shoulders like a heavy cloak. Her father, Philip IV, now looked at his surviving daughter with new eyes. No longer was she simply his little princess who loved sweets and preferred playing with her pets to attending court ceremonies. She was Spain itself, the future of a dynasty that had ruled half the known world. Philip ensured his daughter received an education befitting her new status. She studied Latin with distinguished scholars, learned the intricacies of statecraft, and was instructed in the rigid protocols of Spanish court life. Yet her father also recognized her gentle nature, surrounding her with small comforts, a menagerie of exotic pets, court entertainers who could make her laugh, and all the chocolate her sweet tooth desired. The Spanish court of Maria Theresa's youth was like a living tapestry woven from gold thread and imperial dreams. The great artist Diego Velázquez painted portraits that captured not just faces, but souls, his brush immortalizing the melancholy dignity that seemed to haunt the Habsburg line. Young Maria Theresa often sat for these portraits, learning to hold her small frame with regal composure while her eyes betrayed the loneliness that wealth and power could never cure. But Philip IV was too shrewd a king to ignore political reality. A daughter, as sole heir, no matter how beloved, could spark succession crises that might tear his empire apart. In 1649, when Maria Theresa was 11, her father made a decision that would forever alter her position in the royal hierarchy. He married his own niece, 14-year-old Mariana of Austria, in a union that made even the inbred Habsburg family tree more tangled. The young Maria Theresa watched her father's new bride take her place as Spain's primary queen. When Mariana gave birth to a son in 1661, little Charles, the future Carlos II, Maria Theresa gracefully stepped aside from her position as heir. Yet perhaps she felt a secret relief, for she had glimpsed enough of kingship's burdens to understand what she was losing and what she might gain in return. While Maria Theresa was learning the art of royal sacrifice in Madrid, the political winds across Europe were shifting toward an end to one of history's longest and most bitter rivalries. France and Spain had been locked in almost perpetual state of war since 1494, when French armies first crossed into Italian territories claimed by Spain. For over a century and a half, these two great Catholic powers had turned Europe into their battlefield. The conflict had raged through the Italian wars, spilled into the religious conflicts that tore France apart in the late 1500s, and erupted again during the devastating 30 Years' War. Spanish silver from the Americas funded armies that marched against French forces from the Netherlands to northern Italy. French diplomats supported rebellions in Portugal and Catalonia, trying to break apart Spain's extensive territories. By the 1650s, both kingdoms were exhausted. Spain's treasury was empty despite all the gold and silver flowing from the New World. France, though victorious in many recent battles, was also drained by decades of constant warfare. The time had come for peace, but not just any peace. This would be a peace sealed with the oldest diplomatic tool known to European royalty, a marriage alliance. On November 7, 1659, diplomats from both kingdoms signed the Treaty of the Pyrenees, named for the mountain range that formed the natural border between France and Spain. Among its many clauses was one that would determine Maria Theresa's destiny. She would marry Louis XIV of France, the young Sun King who was already beginning to dazzle Europe with his vision of absolute monarchy. Picture the scene on June 7, 1660, when Maria Theresa first laid eyes on her intended husband. The Isle of Pheasants, a tiny speck of land in the Bidassoa River, had been chosen as neutral territory for this historic meeting. Two elaborate pavilions faced each other across the narrow channel, one decorated with Spanish colors, the other with French. Maria Theresa, now 21, had grown into a pleasant-looking young woman with fair skin and blonde hair that caught the sunlight. She was small in stature and somewhat plump by modern standards, but considered quite attractive by the beauty ideals of her time. Her one vanity was her love of sweets, particularly chocolate, which had given her poor teeth, though she tried to hide this behind demure smiles and graceful conversation. Louis XIV, born just 5 days before Maria Theresa, was already showing signs of the magnetic presence that would make him the most famous monarch of his age. Tall for his era, with dark hair and piercing eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he ruled by divine right. When he looked across that narrow strip of water at his Spanish bride, he saw not just a woman, but the embodiment of peace between their warring nations. The formal ceremonies were magnificent, but the most poignant moment came when Maria Theresa had to bid farewell to her father. Philip IV, now graying and worn down by decades of war and loss, embraced his daughter for what both knew would be the last time. His final words to her would echo in her heart for the rest of her life. "You must forget that you were an infanta and remember only that you are Queen of France." On June 9, 1660, in the small French town of Saint-Jean-de-Luz, Maria Theresa became Queen of France in a ceremony that was both intimate and historically momentous. The marriage mass was celebrated with all the solemnity befitting such an occasion. Yet there was something deeply personal in the way the young couple exchanged their vows, as if they sensed that their union would reshape the destiny of Europe. The journey to Paris that summer was like a royal progress from a fairy tale. Town after town turned out to welcome their new queen, showering her carriage with flower petals and cheering her name. Maria Theresa, who had lived most of her life in the austere corridors of Spanish palaces, was overwhelmed by the warmth of the French people's reception. On August 26, 1660, she made her ceremonial entry into Paris, and the City of Light had never seen such splendor. But beneath the pageantry lay a sobering reality that would shadow Maria Theresa's entire reign as Queen of France. She was marrying her double first cousin, a union that even by the relaxed standards of royal intermarriage was remarkably close. Louis's mother, Anne of Austria, was herself a Spanish Habsburg princess, making the genetic entanglement between the French and Spanish royal lines even more complex. This inbreeding, which had already begun to show its effects in the Spanish Habsburg line, would cast a shadow on Maria Theresa's future children. While she and Louis would be spared the worst effects that would later cripple her half-brother, Carlos II of Spain, their offspring would still bear the burden of their parents' shared ancestry. Within months of her marriage, Maria Theresa discovered she was expecting her first child. The pregnancy progressed well, and on November 1, 1661, she gave birth to a son they named Louis after his father. The little Dauphin, as he was known, brought immense joy to his parents and seemed to promise a bright future for the Franco-Spanish alliance his birth represented. But Maria Theresa's subsequent pregnancies would become a heartbreaking pattern of brief joy followed by devastating loss. Her second child, Anne Elizabeth, was born in November 1662, only to die 6 weeks later in late December. The Queen's grief was profound, but royal duties demanded that she quickly compose herself and continue with court life. The pattern repeated itself with cruel precision. Marie Anne, born in November 1664, also died after 6 weeks in late December. The coincidence of these dates seemed almost supernaturally cruel, as if fate had marked the Christmas season as a time of mourning for the Queen of France. When her third daughter, Marie Therese, lived beyond infancy, Maria Theresa dared to hope that her luck had changed. The little princess brought light into her mother's increasingly lonely world, but even this joy was temporary. In March 1672, when Marie Therese was 5 years old, tuberculosis claimed her life, leaving Maria Theresa to face yet another small coffin being carried from the palace. 2 more sons followed, Philip Charles and Louis François, born in 1668 and 1672 respectively. Both died in infancy, adding to the Queen's collection of griefs. Of 6 children born to Maria Theresa, only her eldest son, the Grand Dauphin, would survive to adulthood, carrying the weight of being her parents' sole surviving heir. The French court, meanwhile, had become the most magnificent in Europe under Louis XIV's rule. The king was transforming Versailles from a modest hunting lodge into a palace that would be the envy of every European monarch. Maria Theresa participated in this glittering world of balls, operas, and elaborate ceremonies, but always as an observer rather than a central figure. Her natural shyness made her seem almost invisible in rooms full of witty, sophisticated French courtiers. She preferred the company of her small circle of Spanish ladies-in-waiting, with whom she could speak her native language and share memories of home. Her dwarf companions, her little dogs, and her ever-present supply of chocolate provided comfort in a world where she often felt like a stranger. The Queen's one strong relationship at court was with her mother-in-law Anne of Austria, Louis XIII's widow. Anne, being herself a Spanish princess, understood Maria Theresa's homesickness and cultural displacement. Together they would visit churches, engage in charitable works, and speak Spanish, creating a small oasis of familial comfort within the French court. Maria Theresa affectionately called her Tia, Aunt, and Anne's presence made the young queen's life bearable. But in January 1666, Anne of Austria died, leaving Maria Theresa more isolated than ever. With her protector gone, Louis no longer felt compelled to show even the pretense of discretion regarding his extramarital affairs. The Queen, who had already endured years of quietly watching her husband's flirtations with various court ladies, now had to witness his increasingly open infidelity. The most painful period of Maria Theresa's marriage began in the autumn of 1666, when Louis fell completely under the spell of Françoise Athénaïs, Marquise de Montespan. This brilliant, beautiful, and utterly ruthless woman would dominate the king's affections for over a decade, bearing him 7 children and flaunting her position as his maîtresse en titre with shameless confidence. Maria Theresa's response to her husband's infidelities revealed both her Spanish dignity and her deep vulnerability. She never confronted Louis directly, understanding that such scenes would only diminish her position further. Instead, she retreated into her private apartments, where she would weep quietly with her loyal Spanish attendants. Yet in public, she maintained her composure with a grace that earned the respect even of those courtiers who might otherwise have dismissed her as insignificant. Louis, perhaps feeling some guilt over his treatment of his wife, would occasionally arrange special entertainments for her. He knew she particularly enjoyed Spanish comedies and would commission performances that reminded her of her homeland. These small gestures of consideration, while insufficient to heal her wounded heart, provided brief moments of happiness in an otherwise difficult life. The Queen's position became even more complex when European politics once again thrust her into the spotlight. In May 1667, Louis launched what became known as the War of Devolution, claiming portions of the Spanish Netherlands on behalf of his wife's inheritance rights. Maria Theresa found herself in the impossible position of watching her husband wage war against her native country, using her name and her supposed claims as justification. The conflict was relatively brief, ending in May 1668 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, by which Spain ceded significant portions of the Spanish Netherlands to France. Throughout this period, Maria Theresa served as an informal mediator, using her influence with Louis to moderate his territorial demands. Her intervention may have prevented even harsher terms being imposed on Spain, though the personal cost to her was enormous. As the years passed, Maria Theresa settled into a quiet dignity that masked profound loneliness. She rose early for private mass, spent hours in prayer and charitable works, and maintained correspondence with her family in Spain. Her letters to her father and later to her half-brother Carlos revealed a woman who had never stopped loving her homeland, despite her successful adaptation to French ways. The Queen's health, never robust, began to decline in her 40s. The repeated pregnancies, the emotional strain of her husband's infidelities, and perhaps the effects of her inbred heritage all took their toll. Yet she continued to fulfill her ceremonial duties with unwavering dedication, appearing at court functions with the same gracious smile she had worn as a young bride. In July 1683, Maria Theresa developed what appeared to be a simple infection in her armpit. In an age when medical knowledge was primitive and dangerous, such ailments could quickly become life-threatening. The abscess grew painful and inflamed, and her physicians, following the standard medical practice of the time, decided to treat her with bloodletting. The procedure went tragically wrong. Whether the physician's knife struck a major blood vessel or whether Maria Theresa was simply too weakened by illness to survive the treatment, she began to fail rapidly. On July 30th, 1683, at the age of 44, Maria Theresa of Spain died in the palace that had been both her glory and her prison. Her final words, according to the courtiers who witnessed her death, were heartbreakingly honest. "Since I have been queen, I have had only one happy day." This confession, spoken as she lay dying, summarized a life that had been shaped entirely by duty and sacrifice, with personal happiness always secondary to political necessity. Louis XIV's reaction to his wife's death revealed depths of feeling that surprised even those who knew him well. Despite his years of infidelity, he seemed genuinely grief-stricken by her loss. Within months, he had secretly married Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon, but this union remained private and produced no legitimate heirs. Maria Theresa's death marked the end of an era, but her legacy lived on through her sole surviving son, the Grand Dauphin. Though he would never inherit the throne, dying in 1711 before his father, his own son would eventually become Louis XV of France, ensuring that Maria Theresa's Spanish Habsburg blood continued to flow in the veins of French kings. Perhaps even more significantly, when Maria Theresa's half-brother Carlos II of Spain died childless in 1700, the Spanish succession passed to Philip of Anjou, her grandson through the Grand Dauphin. Thus, the marriage alliance that had brought a lonely Spanish princess to France ultimately resulted in a French prince becoming King Philip V of Spain, fulfilling the dreams of those diplomats who had arranged her marriage 4 decades earlier. The Treaty of the Pyrenees had indeed brought lasting peace between France and Spain, though at a cost that only Maria Theresa herself could have calculated. Her story reminds us that behind the grand narratives of European history lived real people whose personal sacrifices made possible the political transformations we study today. In the end, Maria Theresa of Spain achieved something that had eluded Europe's greatest generals and diplomats for over a century and a half. She ended the Franco-Spanish Wars, not through military might or clever negotiations, but through the quiet dignity with which she endured a life of beautiful loneliness, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the human heart's capacity for endurance, grace, and love that asks nothing in return. Her story continues to resonate because it speaks to the universal experience of women who have found themselves caught between duty and desire, who have loved without being loved in return, and who have discovered that sometimes our greatest contributions to history come not from what we gain, but from what we're willing to sacrifice for something larger than ourselves.